Good morning and welcome back to Cricket Wings. Today we're going to have a go at transferring a picture onto fabric in the form of stitches. Now, I would normally use one of these embroidery hoops for something like this, but I'm aware that you might not have one of those. So I'm going to try a different technique today, which simply uses an old pizza box and things that you should really have around the house. So, from around the house, I have collected round things. So this is going to be my makeshift embroidery hoop. So the next thing you need is your picture that you want to transfer onto fabric. Now, I have decided that I'm going to do a picture of Frida Kahlo. You might decide that you want to do a picture of a loved one or your favourite scene from holiday. It can be any picture. There's no limits to this really. I have photocopied on my 3-in-1 printer the image in black and white. Now you can skip that step if A, you don't have a printer and the facility to photocopy, or B, you want to work from the original. What I would say is, I'm going to trace this and I'm going to hold it up against a window in order to trace it. And the light will get through this a lot easier than it will get through this. Okay, but you can trace directly from a coloured photograph. You just have to work a little bit harder at that. Okay. So with my photocopied image and some tissue paper. Now I think this is from out of a shoebox when I bought a pair of shoes, and I save things like that just the way I am. So I have got some white tissue paper. Now I'm using tissue paper rather than tracing paper because I'm going to stitch through this eventually into the fabric and then rip the tissue paper off. The thicker tracing paper you use, the harder it's going to be to get it off from the stitches, and the more likely you are to ruin the stitches that you've made. So although it's harder to work with at this point, it will be easier to work with later on in the process. So I'm using tissue paper from a shoebox. So you get your photocopied image, you lay your tissue paper over it, and then you get either some masking tape or some sticky tape, and you're going to stick it down. So I've got tissue paper over the top of my image, and I'm now going to lean against the window so that the light comes through the back of this, and I'm going to trace the basic shape of what I've got here. I've used pencil to sketch over the top of the image that I've got there. Now you could use this technique using 2 thin pieces of paper. You've then got a template for watercolour or anything like that. Equally, you could photocopy this and you could use it for lots of different things, so that you've got the tissue paper, you can make your stitched portrait, and then you could use the photocopy to try different mediums. So you could do a crayon one, a pencil one, colouring pens, watercolour, acrylics, and just play around with the image to the point that you could even have an Andy Warhol style poster on your wall with 4 different images of whatever you've created in 4 different mediums. Embroidery hoop on the bottom, your fabric roughly over the top. Place your image in the middle. Now again, use your fingers to check where it's going to sit. And then the top of your embroidery hoop. So I've got a stapler, a basic household stapler, and it's going to staple through every single layer. My design is on the tissue paper, which sandwiches over the fabric that I want to stitch onto. It's held in between 2 circles made from a pizza box using a household stapler. So it's now ready for stitching. You're going to use the template that you've made on the tissue paper to stitch however you want to. Again, it doesn't have to be lots of different colours. I just happen to have lots of colours. If you've only got one colour, then use that. And have fun with it. Do some stitching. We don't have to make sure that the back is as beautiful as the front unless you're making a handkerchief, because when I do these in hoops, what I tend to do is cut a circle, edge it in and sew it around the back anyway, so nobody actually sees the back. So if you're not a perfect stitcher and you're not going to get the back as perfect as the front, mine won't be, then don't worry, because it's not going to show. Okay? So I'm going to carry on stitching. I'm going to take photos at different intervals as I go along, and I'd love to see what you come up with as well.
Flies away every day. A brush paints the picture I long to portray. Her love, feathered and winged, bound in a cage of gold shining rings, a soulmate twin, cut by a tailor, mountain a king.
I've been stitching and I have put most of the colour onto my design. I think I'm going to need to put a bit more stitching on her face because I've chosen a patterned fabric. But what I'm going to do first is, because I've got all of my outlines on there, I'm going to take the tissue paper off now because I don't want to make it even harder for myself to take it off. So I'm going to leave it in its frame. I'm going to pull off as much of the tissue paper as I can just with my hands, and then I'm going to use some tweezers to get the rest of it out from in amongst the stitches without disturbing the stitches too much. Okay, so I'll do that and then I'll show you where I've got to. Okay, so I've been doing a lot of sewing today. So this is the design that I was focusing on at the beginning, and this is what I've created. I'll take some decent photos of it and I'll put it on here as well. So I've used an old pizza box and cut a circle out of that. I've photocopied the piece and then I've traced it against the window, and then I've used tissue paper as my guide to then stitch on top of the image. So I've taken the staples out and I now have a piece of fabric. Get rid of the rest of that tissue paper. A piece of fabric with my embroidery on it, and I can then frame that however I choose to do so. So this kind of embroidery hoop is what I would normally use to do this kind of piece, but I don't want to stop anybody having a go who hasn't got one at home. So we have found another way of doing that today. And then this is how I will be displaying her up on the wall. So that is how you can get an image onto fabric using a pizza box, some tissue paper, some needle and some threads, and by tracing it against your window. So have fun.